أعطي الكلمة للسيدة لوري ديجون مديرة الإدارية لمكتب كونتوكي لمكتب المحاكم.
Thank you for having me today, and thank you for hosting this wonderful event. We're honored to be here. Appreciate especially King Mohammed VI, the minister, and the Supreme Council of the Judiciary of Morocco. I was asked to speak today on the same topic, and we're talking about modernization of judicial administrative services. And I just wanted to say that the preceding speaker stole two of my first remarks. Number one, I wanted to thank everyone for coming after such a wonderful lunch. I am excited that the room is as full as it is. And number two, I also want to thank the interpreters who've done a fantastic job switching from language to language with sometimes really only a short indication of time knowing what you were actually switching to. And that sort of folds into my remarks because I am from the Commonwealth of Kentucky, one of our 50 states in the United States, and we provide interpreting services for all proceedings in all courts in the Commonwealth. And last year we interpreted for over 68 different languages, and I'm not sure I fully appreciated how difficult that could be for our judges or our interpreters or the administrative staff to need to be able to switch. We frequently don't do language-to-language interpretation. We frequently have to relay from one language to a second language to a third language, and it can become increasingly complicated, as you can imagine. In speaking about, one of the questions I was asked to talk about was what's the experience of the United States in the reform movement, and what are the axes of recent reform? Why were those reforms or initiatives introduced? We actually in our country began talking about reforming judicial administrative services over 100 years ago, around the turn of the 20th century. And the movement was largely progressed by legal scholars, the American Bar Association, and the American Judicature Society. The history of the unification of the court system was a reform called for across the country at that time. However, it was actually several decades later before we began to realize unification as envisioned by the legal scholars in some of the states. Most of the principles, unification is not itself the end goal, but I think it's the principles of unification that we need to consider. One of those principles is that courts be brought from underneath the control of local cities or municipalities or counties in which they're funded by the own revenue that they generate to a standalone branch of government or the judicial branch that's funded by a general fund or what is the state or country's treasury, essentially one budget unit. We moved from a very decentralized system in my state, in Kentucky, beginning in the late 1970s, to a more centralized system that did not just decide cases, but also manage the administration of court business. There's still resistance in a number of states, and I'm going to be quite frank, there's still resistance in a number of places in Kentucky to a strong centralized system. And I imagine that's one of the things that many of you have experienced who've begun a reform movement or work towards unification or uniformity in any way. But you still must focus on the tenets of reform. Reform should really focus on structural unification and administrative unification. Structural unification requires trial court consolidation and simplification into one statewide trial structure, which is the same in every city and every county, and it's divided into judicial districts and circuits. Administrative unification is a centralization of administrative services for a statewide judicial system with management, authority, and responsibility. Unification was recommended in our country because it set the stage for improving the administration of justice and for timely case disposition. With respect to structural reform, all state courts have trial courts of limited jurisdiction and trial courts of general jurisdiction. Most states in the United States have intermediate appellate courts, and then all have a court of last resort. In an attempt to improve court administration at the structural level, major court reform efforts have taken place to unify administrative authority, centralize rulemaking powers, and acquire unitary budgeting and consolidating trial court funding. The federal government in 1988 even spoke to encourage the need for state reform on that level. And it's interesting because the federal courts were looking at state courts, recognizing that we carry approximately 95% of all cases in the United States. But what they recommended were essentially 4 components: a simplified state trial court structure, judicial system rulemaking authority vested in the Supreme Court or Judicial Council, which covered practice, procedure, and administration, judicial system governance authority, and responsibility vested in the Chief Justice or the Supreme Court, and aided by a professional administrator and staff to support that. State funding for all or substantial portion of the judicial system with the unified court system. That budget should also be prepared by the Administrative Office of the Courts and managed essentially by the Supreme Court or the Chief Justice or a Judicial Council in that state. Another question I was asked to address for you today was, why is judicial administration important and how can it contribute to efficiency in judicial service? If the ultimate goal is uniform quality justice, then judicial administration has to be structured to support that goal. It requires judicial leadership and implementation of tested processes and policies. A successful administrative structure should eliminate or substantially reduce any overlap or fragmented jurisdiction among the trial courts. There should be a better deployment of judges and support staff, and you should eliminate conflicting local court rules in order to establish a more uniform process, essentially trying to streamline the trial and appellate court process, and good fiscal management and development of comprehensive fiscal rules. You need a checks and balances on all of your accounting systems, your financial statements, an inventory control system, a payroll and benefit structure, personnel policies, codes of conduct for your staff and the judiciary, personnel administration, a personnel classification and compensation system that includes documented job titles and a documented list of job duties. Implementing, and we've talked a lot about digital solutions and technology solutions, and I know the next panel is going to discuss that, but implementation of technology solutions is very important as well. You need to allow you to collect data and evaluate data to determine your effectiveness. We use in Kentucky one centralized case management system and one electronic filing system, and we operate under the same set of rules for all of our courts. We have 404 elected officials in the judicial branch in our Commonwealth, 284 elected judges and justices, essentially following the Jeffersonian ideal of the will of the people. I think that concludes my remarks, and I hope that I came in under my 7-minute time limit. Thank you.
شكرا على المداخلات. أعتقد على أننا سنمر مباشرة إلى الجلسة الثالثة، وبعدها إن بقي بعض الوقت يمكن أن